Hello, and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I'm your host this week. I am Lisa Cooper. I'm here with Jordan Cooper, who you know as your host every other week, to interview him about his new book, In Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful. It is out now. You can order it. And yeah, so we're here to talk about this today. Just a reminder, Just and Sinner is listener supported. So if you'd like to donate to support the ministry here, which includes the podcast, books, book production, all of those things, all of the other crazy things you do at Just and Sinner are all supported by donors like you. So you can make a contribution. You can click in the description. You have a description thing?
I always put my link to the to the website down there. Yep.
Cool. Do that. And yeah, I think that's it. Did I cover everything?
Yeah, you're good.
Nice. Awesome. Well, today we're going to be talking about this new book. The subtitle is On the Loss of Transcendence and the Decline of the West. So, and obviously if you buy it, your copy will not have this weird strip across as a proof copy.
I know. We've always got the proof copies when we show books here, so.
That's okay. Yeah, we're getting some fresh copies in the mail soon. Anyway. Yeah. So first, do you want to just tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, sure. So this book is on the three transcendentals, as they're referred to, which are truth, goodness, and beauty. So basically, the book is kind of an intellectual history of each of those. It's in three separate sections. So we've got truth, then a section on goodness, and then a section on beauty. And it's kind of an intellectual history of the Western world and how we've kind of moved from a perspective that values these as transcendentals to a perspective that has relativized all of them. So it's kind of a philosophical history, I guess, overview of various philosophical movements and changes that have happened in the West. So
this is actually quite a different book than the other books you've put out. And it's number 10, which I think is really exciting. So congratulations. So you stepped outside of just the kind of exclusive to theology realm, and you entered into the more historical survey of philosophical thought.
Yes.
So why? Why did you choose to write this book? It seems very out of
why did I write this book?
Step with what you normally do.
Yeah, in some ways it is, in some ways it's not, because it's a lot of the same things that I do talk about in other books as well.
Right.
Primarily I've studied a lot of these philosophical movements insofar as they impact theology. So I did already have done a lot of the groundwork for what this book is, and in just studying why, especially in Lutheran theologians, which is my area of expertise, is looking at why certain doctrinal changes occurred from the Reformation and post-Reformation era into the modern era. So that naturally leads to a reading of a lot of philosophy and seeing what's shifted culturally and ideologically. So in that way, it's not really that different in that it's the stuff that I've talked about or has impacted my theological writing. But obviously the scope of this is a bit broader. This is not something that is just for theologians. It's something that I think someone from a not even a Christian approach could pick up and get something from and learn from what's shifted in our culture and in our world. It does have an apologetic focus as well. So there is a bit of an apologetic for Christianity throughout the text. But it's definitely broader than that. It's certainly not Lutheran specific. There are references to some Lutheran thinkers, Johann Gerhard, of course, who I rely on a lot for a lot of things, So that is, of course, I'm going to cite thinkers that are from my own intellectual and theological tradition, but it's not a Lutheran specific book by any means. So why did I write this? I would say there are a few things that led me to the writing of this book. One is doing some reading from a lot of secularists that are trying to deal with our current cultural dilemmas. So I read the text by Pluckrose and Lindsay, Cynical Theories, which is very popular. It's a very popular text. It's one that kind of talks about what's happened in universities in general, where a lot of critical theory has kind of taken over a lot of classic disciplines. And when I read that book, I think the thing that stuck out to me the most was how vapid a kind of secularist approach to these issues is, and how it really doesn't answer anything. It recognizes that there are some issues with where we've gone as a culture, and especially in the academy, but it has nothing to offer as a response. There's nothing to point to except for freedom of speech and the liberal tradition, which isn't really a unified conception of the good. So reading texts like that, and others as well, and just listening to a lot of the popular discourse, I feel like a lot of the conversations that we've had culturally are very surface level. Like they're dealing with symptoms, but they're not really going back to like what are the root issues. So I'm trying to say that the loss of the transcendentals is the root issue. If you know, and there are multiple factors as well. Any kind of treatment like this is going to be simplified, and it's not going to deal with all the factors. There are many factors, of course, so it's not going to be just that. But I'm trying to fill in what I think is really a missing piece of where we are today. Is when you have a lot of voices saying we don't like where things have gone in the academy today, so we're going to basically, liberalism even harder. I think it's missing such a core component of really what went wrong, and there are things that have shifted in the world prior to, the development of a liberal society like we are today. So we can't just go back to, say, the Enlightenment, or we can't just go back to one particular era and say, well, things were better back then. I'm trying to say let's go back much farther and say what shifts led to the Enlightenment, led to eventually, where we are today.
So I think it's interesting, though, because this book doesn't do... It does talk about kind of how it's manifested in our culture today. But this is not a book primarily about cultural symptoms today.
No, it's not.
So, and I think that might be kind of disappointing for some people who pick up the book and go, this is going to answer all of my questions about how do I engage with the world today. So What is the value of doing what you do in this book in kind of outlining the fall of kind of where we were with Western civilization, sort of where we ended up, rather than spending your time talking about the symptoms, as you've said before?
Sure, yeah. So I think, there's so many books written right now. I mean, there's a whole, industry of books written on all of our cultural dilemmas, and cultural shifts and changes are happening faster and faster by the year. So what that means is that any book that's written is going to become irrelevant almost by the time it's published, because
fair
the way that that culture has moved and decided what's right and wrong and shifted that so much. I mean, things that were okay culturally 5 years ago are not okay today.
We've seen that even with some of the TV shows we've watched.
Yes.
Totally. Rewatching Community recently.
Yeah, that's not old at all.
It's not that old.
But episodes are canceled. They can't, air certain episodes. There are jokes that are made. Like, the world is just changing so fast that there certainly is a need to be discussing issue by issue things. Don't get me wrong, and there's plenty out there. But I want to get behind a lot of that and put something out that is much more dealing with foundational issues, because I think that's foundational, right? So foundational issues are the crumbling of the foundations is what has led to these other things.
So what's the hope then?
The hope is a recognition that there are things in our current cultural discussions that are wrong, and that we have gone off track as a society and as a culture in like very profound and foundational ways. So the hope would be a recapturing of the transcendentals, so a recapturing of a sense of goodness and truth and beauty. And I think if we look at what's going on today in our current cultural debates, I think even if you look at differences generation by generation, so look at us millennials compared to what's going on with the Gen Z, the Zoomers. So if you look at trends, like, for example, the millennials are the ones that tended to be hardcore secularists and atheists and very hostile to the church in a lot of ways.
Right.
And we're the ones who bought into the new atheism and this just pure materialism. Gen Z is not doing that at all, and they're looking for something very different, which is why in some ways I think the social justice movements of today have gotten so popular, is because there is this natural desire for people to have a sense of good, a sense of what is evil, and a sense of how I can right the world. And secularism doesn't offer any of those answers. So a lot of what we're seeing today is really a response to secularism. And in some sense, there's a searching for something that is good, that is divinely implanted, a sense of meaning and purpose, and that's how they're trying to bring those things about. So I think a lot of our current issues are really due to this loss of what I've said is a classical Western approach to things like meaning and purpose.
Okay, so what I'd like to talk about next is why the Western tradition specifically. Yeah. So you could have done a kind of global look at things. Why specifically the Western tradition? By focusing on the Western tradition, is that necessarily meaning that you believe that the Western tradition is inherently better than other traditions?
Yeah, and of course, like anytime you talk about the Western tradition, there's going to be that assumption that you're biased, or you're saying other traditions are bad, or and discussions about colonialism and all this other stuff come up. But the fact is this: I am from America. My family heritage is all Western European, like exclusively. And that is my culture, right? That's what I know. So that's what I've studied. That's what I've read. That's the philosophy that I've spent time on. That's the theology that I've largely spent time on. I also would challenge the notion that the Western tradition is somehow identical with being white or Western European either.
Right.
So part of my contention would be that like the Western tradition in a large part is largely African. And especially early Christian influences, which is where people like Athanasius and Augustine and Origen and Tertullian, who's the founder of the father of Western theology, as he's called, they're all from North Africa. So I would challenge that, which I know is an assumption that a lot of people have, that means white. I don't identify those two things at all. But that being said, I think I just am simply not equipped to talk about a lot of other traditions, and I think I would love to see a lot of ideas like this played out from more Eastern perspectives as well, from those classical cultures. That's just not my culture, and it's not my area of expertise. So when we talk about these things, the point is not to say that, especially when we're talking about things like art, that all Western art is inherently better than Eastern art. It's just, that's not true. I don't believe that that's the case. But what I know is Western art. That's just what I've studied. So that of course is a limitation just in my own study. But I also don't want to make a total fool of myself talking about things that I don't know.
Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so before I get into, because I kind of want to talk about truth, goodness, and beauty kind of separately,
yeah.
I have some questions about each that we can kind of cover. I wanted to, so one of the things I do when we're going to have one of these interviews is I normally tweet out something about, if you have any questions, you can send them to me and I'll try to ask them. I feel like before we kind of get into the meat of the argument, and I feel like some of the questions submitted to me will fit in nicely later.
Yeah.
So just because I'm not mentioning it now doesn't mean I'm not going to. But I think we can also cover maybe some of your influences in writing this text.
Sure.
And one of the questions that was sent in was, were you influenced by Roger Scruton? And I think that also gives us an occasion to talk about what other influences also did you have in writing this?
Sure. So, I would say Roger Scruton is a big influence in terms of culture in general,
right.
and how I approach culture,
right.
and specifically Western culture. So, his works on culture specifically have been hugely influential on how I've thought about a lot of issues. His writing on aesthetics as well certainly plays into how I describe things. That doesn't mean I agree with everything he says, by the way. I am much more favorable to certain forms of modern art than Scruton would be. But in general, I agree with his approach to aesthetics, and I think he's extremely helpful. And he uses a lot of language of the transcendentals in his own writing. So he's a modern figure who, in his talks and in his books, has put together a lot of these themes. So he's been definitely influential in that area. In terms of other influences in the book, I would say, I've got to say something about Carl Truman, because I started writing this right after I read his book, and his book was just a very helpful overview of a lot of shifts that have happened, and it was a lot of thinking through Truman and doing those podcasts that I did, a discussion of Truman's work, that I tried to fill in some gaps of some things that he didn't discuss that I also think are important. So that kind of got the wheels turning somewhat here, so I have to say Truman was an influence in that way.
You should link those below too.
Yeah, I can.
So if you're interested,
I can link those podcasts if you want to see like a long discussion of culture and how we got here today. So there's, I don't know, remember, are there 4 parts to that or something like that? I don't even remember. It's been a little while.
I don't recall how many.
Yeah, I don't know. So apart from those influences, I would say the biggest influences are the classical authors, because that's kind of who I'm drawing on the most, right? Is classical philosophy. So Plato and Augustine and Johann Gerhard, Thomas Aquinas. I mean, those are the figures that really kind of shape the story that I'm telling, I guess, more than anything else. I should say, Ed Feser has been a big influence on me in thinking through a lot of these issues.
There was a lot of Feser in the bibliography.
Yeah, I do cite him quite a bit.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
So speaking of the bibliography, just an aside, sure. I think that it's interesting. This is very different than maybe one of your other scholarly texts where you cite kind of each individual piece as you go. And you've kind of reserved some suggested reading a little differently. So why the shift in how you kind of presented your material or your footnotes? Because I think people might have questions about
the way that why
is it formatted slightly differently?
I put a note in at the beginning too. When you're doing like an intellectual survey kind of thing, it's really difficult to figure out how to do footnotes, because I could literally footnote every single sentence with the source that I read that led me to this. At this point, this is stuff that I've read over many years, and it's all just kind of in my head. So what I'm trying to do is take out the resources that have influenced how I think about these things and include all of those. So it's not so much direct citation. So what I chose to do instead is kind of after each section include what works I read that led me to the thoughts that I'm explaining here. It's not that there are no direct citations, and obviously they're cited, but so there are some.
Yeah.
But I've included in the bibliography everything that I've read that really has impacted my thoughts on these issues that have led to the book. But yeah, it's just kind of like a difficult thing, and I went through other intellectual surveys to see what other people had done. It's not usually standard to cite like every sentence or two with a specific citation. I think that would have taken many years. I don't know, to do all of that, because I don't even know where the heck I got a lot of the information from. And like, where did I first read this? I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so kind of moving into the meat of the book, right? So you start off with truth. I think it's interesting how you kind of set it up too, because you have 2 chapters for each: truth, goodness, and beauty. And so can you explain like the setup a little bit?
The setup, like going through each?
Yeah. Well, like how did you set up like the first chapter and the second chapter in each section, and why? Yeah,
so each section is divided up like into like the classical approach, and then how we moved away from the classical approach. So it starts with truth, essentially, and I know like when people read this book, they may be tempted to put it down to reading the first chapter, because I know that the first chapter is the most difficult chapter, which is probably, as an author trying to like sell books that people actually want to read, is probably not a great idea, but I think it's necessary. So the first chapter is on metaphysics, because that's where we're starting with truth. You gotta like muscle through that part, which I think is important, but you can tell like the joy that you have writing the other 2 sections. I do love metaphysics. I know you love metaphysics. So, I just think it comes across very differently. No, I get that. So when we're talking about metaphysics, like realism, versus nominalism, those kinds of questions, it can be a bit difficult for someone who's not philosophically trained, right? To get a grasp on why does this matter. And I know that a lot of people going to these questions are like, this is, they go to the kind of the classic medieval question. It wasn't really a medieval question, I don't believe, but it's the caricature, which is people are debating, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Like, people are debating these questions that don't really matter. It's so abstract. Metaphysics may seem abstract, but it's really not, and it's really at the collapse of metaphysics, I believe, is really at the very foundation of our cultural issues. So I understand some of the difficulty with those who maybe aren't as well equipped in these areas, or who maybe want to say like, why? Who cares? Why does this matter? I want to say that you kind of have to care. You should care, because even if you find some of the conversations may be odd or maybe off-putting and unnecessary, hopefully throughout reading this, you begin to understand why it matters. And you have to lay the foundation there first. So I do have a discussion of the Pre-Socratic philosophers and their approaches to metaphysics leading into Plato and Aristotle, and then getting into the Christian approach through the New Testament and then through the Augustinian tradition.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting to kind of lay that groundwork first, because one of the things I always bring up, and I feel like I've said this in every kind of book interview we've done, is a lot of what you write is to say, pay attention to your own presuppositions.
Yeah.
You can't do theology. This is what a lot of your other works are saying. You can't do theology without being aware of your presuppositions.
Right.
And everyone necessarily comes to the biblical text with a set of presuppositions. Whether or not you want to acknowledge them is important. So
yeah. It's just the question of, are you going to be like conscious of them and acknowledge it, or are you just going to pretend you don't have those?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but what's interesting is this book takes that same principle of be aware of your own presuppositions,
right,
but then applies it to culture rather than exclusively theology.
Right.
So I think it's in the same vein. All of your books kind of do the same thing. Pay attention to your own presuppositions, but this puts it into the cultural context, which I think is interesting, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting. I don't know if anybody else will, but but yes, yeah. It is very much connected to the same kind of things that I've done with other books.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's always my concern. Is like I've always had this concern for like just base level issues of let's get to the foundation. Let's get to what are the fundamental differences, and I try to do this in even a lot of the ecumenical discussions that I have as well. Is like, let's get to what is the core issue. We could talk about differences on baptism and these other things, but like, what's the real foundational issue that leads to those differences? That's always been I think, that's where I've always gone in my work and in my head. I don't know, for whatever reason. So this does definitely continue that kind of thinking.
Yeah, but I think it's also interesting because there are some things that maybe show up in culture that we have just assumed are normal, or the reasonable way of doing things.
Right.
But you kind of bring us back a step and say, well, wait a second, like where did that presupposition come from?
Yes.
And I think that that's a really powerful way to kind of get people to think through cultural engagement in a very different way. And so the truth section, although it's a little bit harder with all of the metaphysics and stuff, I think there is some very good like self-reflective work that can be done in that section as a reader.
I hope so.
That's the goal, I guess.
Yeah, that's certainly the goal.
Yeah, and so you've mentioned that this work is kind of for a broader audience. It's not exclusively Lutheran. A lot of your work has been kind of Lutheran inside baseball, I like to say.
Some of it has, for sure.
Some of it has been. But taking a step outside of kind of only the exclusive like Lutheran world, who is the target audience for this work, and why? Why is that important?
Yeah, so the target audience for this work is not just Lutherans, clearly. We're saying that. It's not just Lutherans. It is Christians, in large part, but not exclusively. So the people that I'm really writing to are, in terms of like education level, maybe we should talk about that, because the question is probably going to be like dealing with metaphysics. Is this something that is accessible? It is something that I've tried to make as accessible as possible, and something that
lots of definitions.
I do lots of definitions. I do lots of illustrations for all of the things I'm talking about. So
I think that's my favorite part of the book.
Really?
Okay. Is all of the silly illustrations. Because, what does it mean to be a dog? And
as
like
you said,
to have dogness.
As you said when I was writing, when you read it, you're like, these are all the things you say in person when you're teaching this stuff.
It's true.
Because you see me teach. And I talk about this stuff with college students all the time. Bible studies and stuff. So this is stuff that I do teach to people that are not philosophically trained necessarily.
And not necessarily highly educated either.
Yeah, right. But with that being said, I mean, it's a book that you probably have to, if you're not familiar with the background, you're probably not going to be able to like skim through the book quickly. You probably have to spend some time thinking about it, just because of the nature of the concepts themselves.
But I also think that there's something very valuable in being able to read a text that makes you take a step back and kind of consider yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
I think there's something very valuable in that. So maybe it's not a bad thing to kind of go a little bit slower.
No, I think that is, I think that's good. And that's the nature of philosophy anyway. When I read philosophy books, I don't read super fast like I do with most other books. Because that's just the nature of the discipline. If you want to do it well, you've got to actually stop and think about what you're reading a bit.
Right.
That's just kind of what it is. So, if you just kind of read through it quickly, that kind of stuff, you're probably not doing it right. Though, of course, someone who has a background in metaphysics and knows what this is can probably skim through this fine and get what's going on. But
yeah, because it is kind of a broad overview and it's not super detailed on one person in particular. So you don't have to have come to the text having read Plato to get kind of an overview of what he thinks.
Yeah, that's true. Sure.
There's no required reading before reading this.
No.
If that helps.
No. I don't think so. That wasn't the purpose. So I'm also I talk a lot about Christianity in here, and there is a bit of an apologetic for Christianity. Now, the apologetic wouldn't make sense if I was only writing to Christians, of course. So I do have in mind, people who are trying to kind of rediscover the classical world in some ways, which I've seen even outside of the Christian tradition.
Right.
So I think the broad appeal of someone like Jordan Peterson, right, who's talking about meaning, and people are interested in purpose and meaning and asking a lot of these kinds of questions.
And personal responsibility and all of those things.
Yeah, because they're seeing kind of the chaos around the world and the chaos in morality and in their own lives and want to look for order and meaning in those kinds of things. So there are, I think, a number of people that are searching for something, right? They're looking for those kinds of answers. So part of this is to appeal to those kind of people as well, who maybe aren't Christians and maybe are thinking through some Christian ideas and aren't quite sure what they think at this point. So this hopefully will help them connect some of the dots.
Yeah. So I'd like to move on to the goodness section.
Yeah.
Just so we get through the things. So
yeah, I know we're almost halfway through
it's
already.
Fine.
So.
We're doing great, guys. So I think this is a good place to kind of illustrate how you form an argument in each section, right? So when we talk about goodness, you start with how did we get to where we are now? Yeah. And how has that sort of played itself out in our culture a little? I mean, you get into it a little bit. So how do you map out and trace from one point to another? And we got to relative truth. How did we get here?
How do we get to relative truth?
Yes.
Okay. How do I explain that briefly? Yeah.
Well, just kind of track how you got, how you illustrate it in the book, or how you kind of...
How we got to, sure. So, in some ways, coming to the perspective of relative truth that we have right now is kind of an inevitability. And this is part of my argument, is that we've already gotten rid of the transcendental ground of our own being, and which is God, is what I'm talking about, to be clear. So, but of goodness and beauty, we've already subjectivized every other aspect of life in the Enlightenment, and we tried to hold on to some kind of objective truth in some sense, but we've divorced it from goodness and beauty. We've divorced truth from God.
Right.
And once you've done that, you've already taken out the foundation. So it's only inevitable that collapse is going to happen. And so what we're seeing now is really the inevitable result of what's happened over many centuries. If you want to look at kind of how I trace it and what movements I see as causing that, I do go back to nominalism in the medieval period to some extent. And I think that there are consequences to nominalism if it is worked out consistently. And nominalism being the idea that there aren't real essences, or in other words, you can read the book for more details, but the categories that we use in the world of, to divide things, like species, for example, because that's the example I give, right? I use dogs. So if you take dogs, the nominalist says, well, what is the category of dog? The nominalist says that's something that I impose on the world through my mind, or my linguistic categories. So we as humans have chosen to make the category of dog by identifying these things that have these certain characteristics together. So what you have there is already a kind of subjectivizing about what's out in the world, because it's largely dependent on the categories that we make. So a lot of modern ideas about truth, and we're still seeing this today in terms of social constructions of gender and those kind of things, really do in some ways, I think, stem back to nominalism. That doesn't mean the nominalists were saying all the same things that are being said today.
Right.
But I do think there's a consistent outgrowth of ideas that we see in someone like Kant. I think Kant is a really key figure. In some ways, Kant is the most important figure, I think, for the modern world. And Kant's so interesting because he really tries to hold on to the transcendentals in some way, but also can't. But also Kant. People always... Yeah, sorry. People always make stupid puns with Kant's name, but
that's all we did in my Kant class in college.
That's basically the point of reading Kant. Is do that.
Yeah.
But you have these figures like Kant, who's really drawing from Hume and trying to correct Hume's like complete total skepticism, and Kant comes up with a kind of solution that like doesn't really work. It's like having a hole in your boat and you just put a bunch of tape over it that like, it maybe will hold for a small period of time, but eventually it's going to come off and the water's going to come in and you're going to sink. I think that's kind of what Kant does at this point. So that's really a large part of the story. But then we get into postmodernism and those kinds of questions of movements that are more blunt about subjective truth. But I think it's kind of a consistent outgrowth of a lot of other things we've seen prior to that.
Yeah, so I think, especially in the goodness section, I think you point at a lot of kind of major cultural issues in a way that, you get to some in beauty, but that's more of a different, we'll get there. But but why some things and not others? I feel like you bring up some certain cultural issues. You can't do everything, obviously, but there are some key social issues that you bring up related to kind of the fallout of certain philosophers.
Sure.
So how did you connect philosophers with that kind of cultural impact?
Yeah, and I know, when you read through some of the issues that I do pick, you may look at that and be like, oh, this is just culture warring because it's...
Right, but there's a reason why you picked them specifically.
Because I'm using certain things and not others. But the reason is because those specific shifts philosophically and morally are the result of particular ideological shifts.
Right.
So I deal with like three shifts in detail. I know some...
You mentioned a lot of other things kind of tangentially. In some detail.
I mean, it's all very overview, so... not as much detail as I could have, but I give the examples of abortion, gender issues, and how we see gender today, specifically related to marriage, but beyond that as well, and then pornography. So those three things are really an outgrowth of a lot of other issues. So maybe I'll start with pornography because why not? So
right. I think you do in the book too.
Yeah. I'll start there. I don't know if that means it'll be demonetized if I use that term, because I'm probably not allowed to use that term on a monetized YouTube video. I don't know. So we'll see, I guess. So we're talking about pornography. What I don't mean is sexual immorality in general, because culture has always had sexual immorality. The world has always had prostitution. Thomas Aquinas talks about this. The medieval world, it's not like there's some ideal medieval world where people were all moral and then modernism came and people started acting terribly. I mean, read the reformers and what's going on in the church at that time. The world has always had immorality issues. But I think it's what's shifted in pornography is the widely accepted moral grounding of pornography.
Right.
Because it's different to say people are sinners and they'll go see a prostitute, and that's different from saying that pornography is just an ordinary part of human life.
Right.
A very different kind of take on things, and pornography in many ways is also just related to how it's consumed and how common it is in technology. It's a very different conversation, I think, than some of the other older immorality that happened. At least back then, immorality was kind of hidden because there was a stigma about it, which people at least knew that it was supposed to be wrong, I guess. So, but today we don't even have that. A lot of this, when we're talking about the moral issues, comes down to our perception of what is right and wrong as being based in our own individual liberty. right, or our own freedom of expression. So there are a number of shifts that lead to this, but essentially, especially in an American Western context that is largely indebted to liberalism, we do tend to see ourselves first as individuals, and individuals who have rights, and we can use those rights to do whatever we want as long as we don't infringe on the rights of other people. So we're kind of a bunch of autonomous, free in the sense of we act without constraint. So we are autonomous, free individuals, and we're kind of forced to live in a society. So when we're forced to live in that society, we have to give up some of those freedoms. But ultimately, what we are in our essence is still these freely choosing kind of beings. So when we get to a question like, and that really, I think, gets to actually all three of the issues that I'm talking about here, is when we talk about something like pornography, the morality really comes down to nothing more than consent.
Right.
Because the question is not what is, seen an older moral perspective, a teleological one as it's referred to, where we have moral ends in view. You could say that, you could start a question like about sex. What is moral about sex? You would start with the question of, well, what is sex for? What is it good for?
Right.
What is the function of it? What is its proper context? You start with the definitions, right? What is it? And then you extract the moral implications of that from the what it is or what it is for. And this is something that, Socrates does. This is part of the Socratic method. And Socrates, if you read Plato's dialogues where he uses Socrates as a character, Socrates comes across as very annoying because he's just kind of walking around asking people, how do you define this word? And kind of correcting and everything they say and asking them a million questions. But he must have been, if he really did that, I don't know. Obviously, he's kind of a character there in Plato's, in his dialogues, so we don't know how accurate it is. But at least from some of the portrayals kind of mocking Socrates we have, it does seem like he kind of had a reputation for doing exactly that. So
it's cool. I like it.
but what he was trying to do...
It's like having a 4-year-old around. Why?
It
Why?
is exactly
Why?
that.
Why?
Yeah, it
Why?
is. But he's trying to get people to really think about, well, what does that word mean? When you say justice, what is justice exactly? Like, you use the term all the time, and you're referring to things as just or unjust, but what do you mean?
Right.
What is justice? That's the kind of deep-level thinking we don't have today. It's the foundational defining of terms, because we just throw things out all the time, and this is our cultural discourse. You're this, you're that, we have specific terms that we label people that we don't like, and that just means you dismiss them, but we haven't defined any of the terms. Or defined what's actually good or not good.
Yeah. There was a really interesting exercise I had to do in high school political science class. The teacher gave us a bunch of different definitions, or different words, and he said, define these in like 10 words or less. Liberty, justice, those kinds of things. And it was fascinating because everybody in the class struggled with it.
Yeah.
But I think, if you're a parent, these are things that you can start to kind of get your kids to think about, especially if they're like going into high school, college age. Being able to define things in a way that is like consistent and decent, I think can help shape all of the conversations that they have going forward and kind of equip them in that way. So that's my like 2 cents for practical ministry there. Sorry.
No, that's good. No, that's good, because like bringing up those terms like liberty, justice, like we use them all the time because we're Americans, but it's true that we don't even think about what those terms mean.
Exactly.
We just kind of assume them, and we need to take a step back and say, wait, why? Like, why am I saying that? What do I actually mean by this? What are the implications of that? And so when we do that, I think in relation to these issues that I mentioned, if we're autonomous individuals and morality is largely defined by my not impinging upon your rights, because we are fundamentally free creatures that have fundamental rights, then the questions of morality are going to be, well, does it impinge on your fundamental rights or not? And if you are freely consenting to, be involved in pornography, and if I'm freely consenting to watch you in pornography, then it's okay, because everybody's consented. Now, there's plenty to challenge there in terms of what actually is consent in the porn industry, and that is something I would challenge very strongly, that there's really consent, and what exactly does consent mean when you're really kind of coercing people by promising all sorts of things that aren't delivered, and it's a mess. But that's kind of the basic moral structure there. I think that leads to that being acceptable in our particular society. But then when you get to the question of marriage, that is, I think, shows very well what's going on here, which is when we're talking about a question like, say, homosexual marriage or polyamorous marriages or whatever it might be, fundamentally, people start with the assumption of marriage is a free contract between consenting individuals, and that free contract can be broken off whenever you want. This is why you have no-fault divorce, because we're just free individuals with rights, and if I choose to enter into that contract for a while, I can, and if I choose to leave it, I can. And if 5 people choose to enter into that contract for a while, why not? Because it's just a free contract. So we have to ask the question more fundamental, which is, well, what is marriage in the first place? Maybe we should challenge that. Is marriage just a free contract between whoever and whoever? Or is that just kind of an arbitrary definition? So if we're talking about someone like Aristotle, we would start with the question of what is marriage for, and then work back from there. To say, okay, if we've established this is what it's for, how do we do that? How do we orient our lives in this institution toward that good? And that's true of any social institution as well, he would say. So it's a fundamentally different way of approaching our world and our institutions. And then the question of abortion, the reason I bring that one into it as well is that, not just because I think it's a moral evil, which I do, but because I think it's a good example of something that demonstrates this confusion of categories in how we totally redefine terms. So the term healthcare, right? Well, what is healthcare? Classically, we're going to define healthcare as what it's for, what it does, so that your body is supposed to work in a particular way. In other words, there is purpose in all the parts of your body. Your eyes are for seeing, your ears are for hearing, your nose is for smelling. We have particular organs and body parts that are doing things. And what a sickness or illness or disease or like nice. A broken bone or whatever, any bodily ailment is essentially something is getting in the way of that thing doing its proper functioning,
right? Doing
what it should do. So if I'm trying to think of a particular example, but if I break my foot, what's wrong with that is my foot is for walking, and if I break my foot, I can't walk. It is not doing what its function is. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. So healthcare means that you take that block out of the way that is stopping the thing from functioning in its proper order. So if I go to the doctor and I get a cast on my foot, eventually the goal is that it will heal. Healthcare is that which heals so that things can work toward their proper ends, so that my foot can walk again. Well, when you start saying things like abortion is healthcare, you fundamentally redefined what healthcare is. Because what you're doing is exactly the opposite of how healthcare is normally defined, which is your body is for, your womb is for creating life, and that is part of the proper functioning of what's happening in the body, and abortion is stopping the thing from doing its proper functioning. So you're ending a life and you're stopping a natural bodily process. So how does that fit into the definition of healthcare? What you're doing is fundamentally redefining what healthcare is. So we need to stop and stop just, when you have these conversations where, well, not conversations, but like the people on Twitter that just put in all caps, abortion is healthcare, like a bunch of times in a row. That's the kind of level of argumentation we've fallen into in our society, is you just repeat something a bunch of times and that's it. But well, what is healthcare in the first place? We need to actually have that conversation, because you can't say abortion is healthcare without defining what healthcare even is. And the only way that abortion would fit into healthcare is if you start defining healthcare not by your body, but by your psychological state, which is something that happens when we're defined primarily as autonomous individuals, is we define ourselves by like what we're thinking and how we're feeling. And I think the place where we're at now as a culture is we've even started using language of psychological harm in our laws, and that leaves a completely impossible standard to trace in terms of what harm is and what harm isn't. Because as soon as you move from bodily harm to psychological harm, that's completely subjective, and you can define psychological harm as whatever you want. So that's how you can justify abortion, to say, well, it causes the mother psychological harm because she can't take care of this baby, therefore it's permissible. But I think that's more of an assumption that's taken for granted than is actually argued for. And once you actually start to think through the implications of that, it really cannot, the standard of psychological harm cannot sustain a society. It's completely impossible. Anyway, yeah, so that's my long answer to your question. And I know we're far beyond the time that you wanted me to be in answering them.
All right, so for the third section, I wanted to talk about beauty. I also want to get to a few
I want to make
questions.
sure we get to the questions, too.
So, very quickly, I think in reading the beauty section, it was very obvious how much you love art and design. And so just, for fun, I think it would be cool to talk about why you're so excited about art.
Yeah.
Because you can read the section. I think that this is probably the most accessible section.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's this is probably the section people are most interested in because it's a topic that isn't talked about as much. I mean, there's a ton written about, and said about objective morality and objective truth, but not as much said about objective beauty. So,
but I do think that each of these sections could have been multiple books, or a book in and of themselves, like a much longer book. But the beauty section I think is really fun because you get to describe some kind of contemporary art.
Yeah.
And, what brought you to love art so much?
Yeah, so that art is like my other love apart from theology. That's like what I would have gone into if I didn't go into theology, probably. I just loved art as a kid. I was always drawing and, I loved art. I loved going to art museums, and I've always been interested in aesthetics in many ways, not just art, but in decor and clothing and everything else. That's just, I love it. So I've always had this interest. So I for a long time wanted to delve into the area of aesthetics in some piece of writing, because I've got all this reading I do in art, and I just have this passion for it. I'm like, I should do something useful with it at some point in my life. So this was my first attempt at using this knowledge and love of art for something like this. So yeah, that's the basic background of my enjoyment of this stuff. But I mean, when I'm not reading, well, I'm doing a lot when I'm not reading theology books, then I'm reading novels as well, but a lot of art books and novels. I kind of go back and forth between theology, philosophy, classic literature, and books about art. But I do a lot of reading in those areas. So it's something that I really care about a lot. And I think just thinking through how ugly our world is, especially modern, the products of modernity, in many ways, there isn't a prizing of beauty. There isn't a desire for beauty. And I think that desire for beauty, however, is something that is fundamental to humanity, and it's inherent to us. So if we're going to talk about meaning and purpose, the place where we really probably find meaning and purpose, or the desire for it, or the searching for it more than anywhere else, we see that, I think, in the arts.
Yeah. I'm going to encourage people to muscle through the the first two sections. I think that they're good.
You make it sound like it's torture to read the book.
No. I just think if you're not necessarily a philosopher, it might take a little bit more time and self-reflection than just breezing through, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the beauty section I felt like was kind of breezy in a way that the other two sections weren't. But I think it's fun. You use a lot of concrete examples from our lives, modern architecture. I just think it's fun. So I'm going to encourage everybody to get there,
Yeah. But I do argue for beauty being something objective.
Right.
And I think that's probably the biggest, the most controversial claim of the book, I guess, because it's controversial today.
It is. It is, especially when, I think there's a huge push in our culture to say everything is beautiful. Or you need to come around to believe that everything is beautiful.
Because if something is ugly, it's the result of prejudice in one way or another.
Yeah, but saying that beauty is objective is not necessarily saying that, there are things, I don't know. I feel like sorry, this would be a whole other rabbit trail, which is why I'm stopping myself.
Oh, okay.
If you were to get into the conversation about for example, all of the ads that come out, they prize, beauty in certain ways.
Yeah, sure.
In depicting people. And the only reason why you wouldn't want a certain model over another model would be prejudice rather than... But I think that it's interesting because when we acknowledge that, beauty is that which comes from God and people are made in the image of God, I think that there is like a very strong Christian argument for accepting and loving people and believing that they're beautiful.
Well, I think as something... But
that's an aside.
Yeah, but it's something that I talk about in Plato is that ultimately, Plato talks about external beauty to an extent, but he's kind of, in many ways, he shies away from talking about it at all because he recognizes that any kind of external beauty is really only a reflection or a shadow of the truer beauty.
Right.
Which we would identify as God. But beyond that, we also, and Peter talks about this. So I cite, Peter in Scripture, who talks about showing forth your beauty not in your, with your braided hair and those kind of things, but the beauty of the virtuous character or the good character. So that external beauty is not the ultimate end of beauty, and everybody knows this. There can be like a person who is very attractive and knows they're very attractive and is a jerk to everybody, and they're a very ugly person inside. So, right, like this is the thing that we all know, and this is where, isn't that where like the mean girl trope kind of comes from, right? It's the like person who's nasty on the inside but attractive on the outside, and so when we're talking about beauty, it's not just a matter of like physical.
But I do think that that's where it's come up in our culture the most, is talking about physical beauty.
Yeah, you are right. You're right. So we have to, what I'm not saying, is, and maybe talking about, beautiful people is not really the best place to go with beauty. Because we're not, when you're saying objective beauty, you're not, the intention of that is not to say that, you can, like, line up a bunch of people and decide who's prettier and who's whatever like that's missing the point here altogether. But the point is, it doesn't mean that beauty isn't something that's real in the world. And I think the difficulty with beauty, though, in terms of its objectivity, is that it isn't as easy to quantify.
Right.
And I think that's kind of just part of the nature of the subject, because there is a subjectivity to our perception of beautiful. So, if the way that that I would look at you as my spouse as beautiful is probably it should be different than how I look at someone else's spouse as beautiful. Like, hopefully they think that person is more beautiful because that's because of the nature of that relationship. My point is just to say that there is a subjectivity in terms of that. But that doesn't mean that beauty is subjective. What it means is that our perception of it is subjective and our experience with it is subjective. But of course it's going to be subjective. It's because I am a subject, and that's how I encounter it. But that doesn't mean that beauty as a whole is something that is just purely internal to the self. So it's to say that when you encounter something in your own life and you have this subjective experience of delight in something being beautiful, the reason you are having that subjective experience is because the beauty of that object or that person or whatever, or that piece of music or whatever it might be, is pointing you to and sharing in the transcendental reality of beauty. So to say that beauty is objective is not to say that we all need to have the same tastes.
Right. And I think that's where I wanted to go with all of this.
Right.
So
I think that probably gets to what you're talking about with like different bodies. Like we're not saying like you have to have
whatever. Body, a certain look or something to be beautiful. It just has to. You
don't need a sculpted body. So no, like you're missing the point. Certainly, if that's your takeaway,
But that's why people were so like. That's why people were talking about dad bods for a while there.
Oh yeah.
Very there was popular discourse around this.
Yeah, there was.
Yeah. Anyway,
and that's But I think, you can, to some extent though, you can recognize, as much as there's subjectivity in some way in terms of how we encounter beauty, which I'm saying is objective, because God is the most beautiful, and God is certainly objective. So if you take God out of the equation and God is not the beautiful, then all there is my subjective enjoyment of a thing, and beauty is identified with enjoyment. or pleasure, which is a really problematic thing, because I think there are plenty of things that bring pleasure that are not beautiful. And we inherently know this. Like, if you watch...
Well, the law is written on your heart.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. This is part of the internal knowledge of God, right? The law written on the heart. So that people enjoy pornography. They enjoy it a lot. They get pleasure out of watching it, but it is not beautiful. In fact, it is ugly. And if people have a twisted delight in watching, gore videos, which people do, that is not beauty. And we recognize that, right? We know that's not beautiful. You can try to convince yourself that it is or something just to prove your subjectivism to be right, but we know that it's not beautiful. So I think we inherently recognize the distinction between something being beautiful and then internal pleasure. Like, they're just not identical.
But I think that's one of the most compelling arguments in the book, is that we have to order our desires.
Yes.
In order to orient them toward the good.
Yes.
And then that's like the foundational place.
Yes.
That's the takeaway.
Yes.
Right? If you just do whatever you want whenever you want, it's not properly ordered.
Right, but if beauty is purely subjective, then there isn't really a way to order your desires for the beautiful or the good.
And then you
Because
could convince
no
yourself that ugly things are beautiful.
Exactly.
Or things that are bad for you are beautiful.
But you can do this with, and we don't have to, we could talk about, the high arts, and, we could talk about opera and classical music and, Renaissance art or something, things that are like the high arts that often are the standards of beauty for a lot of people. And obviously I think there's beauty in those things. But I think we can talk just in a more ordinary sense of things we encounter regularly in the world. Why is it that people use the word tacky to refer to things?
Or chuggy.
Chuggy, if you're one of the Zoomers. Because you recognize that, like, things are kind of, why do you call things corny or cheesy? You're making an aesthetic judgment when you say that, because you're recognizing there's something that's not classy about this. There's something that's not beautiful about this. Or you do this with movies. If you watch The Room or Birdemic, or we've watched many bad movies, but if you watch like one of those...
Okay, but we also love bad movies.
I do like bad movies, but they're really entertaining. But the question is, if you love bad movies and are entertained by them, like we are, are you entertained by them? Do you enjoy them because they're beautiful? Like, no, of course not.
No.
You're making a distinction. You watch them because they're not, and that's kind of the point. You're like, but you know the difference between a good performance and a bad performance, whether it's in music or in acting or, a good artist or a bad artist. There's a reason why, everybody laughed at that restoration of that Jesus painting from years ago, because it was like really bad. And that's not subjective. It objectively was not painted well. So there's some kind of standard that we recognize, that there are some things that are beautiful and some things that aren't. And so what we can't do is say, just because there's some subjectivity in terms of what we think is beautiful and someone else does, that means that that's all there is to the conversation at all.
Right. But again, that's kind of taking a step back and kind of reevaluating.
Yes, exactly.
Yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a good time to shift focus, because we're almost almost out of time.
We're at an hour.
So,
we can go quickly go through the questions.
Well, hold on. Let me Okay. We have, let's see. What are some good entry points into the primary sources of the Western tradition?
Primary sources of the Western tradition. There's a lot.
Well, like, is there a good starting place to go find primary sources?
Yeah. There's, I have, these volumes, the great books. You can get all of these kind of great book sets, but this is only a small portion of the set. The set's like huge, right? And I think that the difficulty in getting into great books is that it seems overwhelming. Right. Because there's so much.
I would say pick one thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best idea.
And then pick another thing. Like, go slowly. It doesn't have to be...
Yeah, I think it becomes overwhelming when you look at, like, just the corpus and are like, I have to know all these books. I have to read, like... And some of it you probably won't enjoy reading. And that's also okay. I would say a great place to start, if you want to do primary sources, I can recommend secondary sources, but I think you kind of got to start with Plato in a lot of ways. Of course I would say the Bible, but apart from that, I would say start with Plato. And when you do that, get a volume that's like selections from Plato's dialogues.
Right.
Don't start with just the Republic and read straight through it. You can get different sets that are selections and selections that have introductions, that people kind of explain what are the major ideas, what are the major points before you read the primary text. Those kinds of things are really good. I have a great, it's selections from Plato's dialogues, and I'm looking at the book now, but it's very pretty looking, but I don't remember the author, the guy who put, or the person who put it together, or the publisher or anything. So, but there are a number of those kinds of things. But there are some things that, like, I would say don't start with. It's just like when you start reading the Bible, don't start with Leviticus. You're probably going to be really confused and not want to read more. So don't jump into Thomas Aquinas. He's very difficult. Don't jump into Aristotle first. He's also very difficult to read.
But also that will burn you out too.
That's the point. It's like you get burned out and then you give up.
Yeah.
So and great books is such a broad, what is that? What do you mean exactly? The Iliad and the Odyssey. You want to start there maybe. Those are of course great books. There are also a lot of great kind of adaptations for younger readers that we give to our kids.
Those are fun.
Of classic books.
Yeah, if you're doing, if you're homeschooling your kids or you're supplementing at home for whatever schooling your kids are doing, those are great options to get them.
Yeah,
You're hitting the microphone.
Sorry, I've got a couple things right here in my bookshelf. I've got these graphic novels of Hamlet and Macbeth they're like put out by Spark Notes, but it's like an easier version of Shakespeare.
Our kids love them,
and kids love them. To some degree, though, sometimes it can actually be good if you want to read classic books and you haven't done it before, to read a summary, or read something that's like an easier to read version and then go to the original source.
Right.
And I think that's okay. I know people are kind of embarrassed to do that because it's like you got to go to the source itself, but you've got to get yourself to the level where you feel like you really know what's going on, and it's not going to benefit you any if you just jump into the Summa with no background.
But there are also, YouTube is a great resource, right? Like you can find people talking about all of these things as well, true. Which is cool. You also have an introduction to all the philosophers on YouTube.
Yeah,
you're not plugging that.
I need to continue that. Maybe that's my.
I'm just gonna plug all of your works.
Maybe that's my shame in not continuing the series. I have a bunch planned and I just haven't continued it. But.
Yeah, but you could. So if you would like that, you can leave a comment.
Yeah, but I have all the Pre-Socratics into Plato.
Try to force him to do more.
I would like to.
That'd be good. So who are some?
Takes time.
Who are some contemporary people who are doing this kind of work? A couple good kind of secondary sources who are also working in the same topics.
I mean, Roger Scruton just passed away recently, but he's still recent, and I kind of recommend looking at his lectures. He's got a bunch of great lectures on these topics, so and he's very delightful to listen to. Louis Marcos is great. He just released a book on Plato, and he has a lot on just interpreting the Western tradition specifically through a Christian lens. And he's very involved in the classical education movement. So I've really liked what I read of his, and he put an endorsement on the book. I reached out to him, and James Matthew Wilson is someone else who I reached out to as well, who he has a book on truth, goodness, and beauty that I think I think it's very good. It's probably a little bit of a difficult read for someone without a philosophical background, but it is a really good book on the subject as well.
His poetry is good too.
Yeah, and he's written a lot on poetry.
That's what I've read.
And that's her like area of expertise more than mine, but it's there are people doing this in all different areas. There's people doing this in literature, in poetry, in theology, philosophy. I know Leland Ryken released a book this year that I haven't read yet on literature that I think it has True, Good, and Beautiful in the title somewhere. And Ryken's work that I've read elsewhere is very good, so I'm sure that's a good resource as well. If you're thinking about classical literature, you can go read Harold Bloom if you want to see a grumpy old man, but
he's not my favorite.
No, he's just kind of the go-to guy for a lot of people because he's a Yale guy who wrote the book The Western Canon, but he's
exorbitantly pretentious.
He's very pretentious, and really he does not like Christianity, and he's really obnoxious. But a lot of people do read him, so he's there. Lightheart's done some good writing on like Jane Austen and some other literature as well. he's a good guy for if you want classic literature stuff from a Christian perspective.
Karen Swallow Prior.
Yeah, she's written on Reading Well, I think was very good. On a lot of classical literature there as well.
Yeah.
And
her
the
whole
connection
series
between
of all of
and the connection between virtue and literature, which
Yeah.
is very classical.
But she's releasing a lot of literature with kind of a Christian approach at the beginning, too. So that's worth checking out. If you want to get into classical literature and you feel like you don't know where to go, you can have someone kind of guide you through it, too, which is good.
Yeah, in terms of ethics, I mean, there are so many topics I talk about, so I don't even know where to go here. But in terms of ethics, I would say, I mean, Gilbert Meilander's great. Coming from he's a Lutheran ethicist, and it deals with these issues very well, but also coming from a virtue ethics perspective, which is a classical approach to ethics.
He's also fun to read.
Yeah, he's great. He's great.
Like, if you want something that's not super heavy-duty intense, that's a good place to start.
Yeah,
Meilander's fun.
Meilander is great. And then Bierman's work is really good if you want just a kind of theological framework for that classical virtue ethics approach.
Yeah.
But then also, sorry, I have so many I could recommend. Robert George is great, too, if you want like a natural law theorist, Roman Catholic. Ryan Anderson's very good. If you want to see a lot of these classical categories used in contemporary debates. I know they're controversial figures in a lot of ways because of the issues that they delve into, but they're doing a great job in terms of natural law perspective on these issues.
Yeah. I think we got to stop. It's late.
All right. Yeah, no, I know. So.
Yeah.
All right.
So there are lots of other questions. Sorry, I didn't get to all of them. I do think that it would be interesting. One of the questions had to do with classical education. Yeah. I think you could probably do a whole podcast on that topic.
Yeah, I've kind of been meaning to, because that relates to this, of course.
Yeah. And I feel like you've also done lots of additional reading and stuff about classical education. That's me putting in a plug for a whole podcast on that question. So we'll see if he does it. Who knows? Sometimes he listens to me and does podcasts about the things I suggest. So we'll see. So yeah, thank you for all of the fun information about your book. Yeah. If you'd like to get it, it's available on Amazon. You can also, fun fact, if you have like a Target gift card or a Barnes & Noble gift card, you can also buy them through.
Yeah, you can on
those places.
Yeah.
So, in defense of the true, the good, and the beautiful, on the loss of transcendence and the decline of the West. Check it out. Also, fancy cover.
Fancy cover. That's the goal, is to have a fancy cover.
Yeah.
Somebody was disappointed it didn't have a cloth-bound hardback, though.
Yeah. Sorry, everybody.
Gold leaf pages. Sorry, it's not
that fancy.
No.
It's mildly fancy. It's accessible fancy.
Well, thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to do this.
Happy to do it.
And so if you do read the book and you enjoy it, make sure to leave a review on Amazon and Goodreads. That always helps as well. And let me know your thoughts. Thanks so much.
Cool. Bye.